Welcome, everyone. Just give it a few minutes and we'll get started here with the webinar. Thank you for joining us. All right. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. My name is Erin Heltkamp. I am the National Solar Activists Network and Policy Coordinator for Solar United Neighbors. We really appreciate you joining us this evening to learn how you can stop utilities from using your money against you. Please share your name and location in the chat while we get started. For those of you who might be new to Solar United Neighbors, SUN is a national nonprofit that helps people go solar, join together, and fight for their energy rights. We're a community of people building a new energy system with a rooftop solar at the cornerstone. And we're all stronger when we work together. That's why several organizations, united by our commitment to clean energy and an equitable energy transition, have joined together this evening to elevate how monopoly utilities abuse their power and use their money to fund initiatives that slow the clean energy transition, raise rates, and reduce access to affordable renewable energy solutions. Our panelists of experts will provide an overview of this problem and the growing national movement to hold utilities accountable. You'll learn what's happening in New York and how we can all fight back to get the politics out of our utility bills. A huge thank you to the organizations supporting tonight's event: 350.org, 350 Brooklyn, 350 NYC, Alliance for a Green Economy, All Our Energy, Earth Justice, Energy and Policy Institute, Long Island Progressive Coalition, New Yorkers for Clean Power, Sane Energy Project, the Climate Reality Project, the New York Metro chapter, and the Climate Reality Project, Long Island, New York chapter. Before we get to our panelists, a few logistics. Next slide, please. We welcome questions. To ask a question, we encourage you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any comments, to please place them into the chat. We'll try to answer those as your questions as we go out throughout the presentation, but we'll also hold some of your questions to address at the end. The webinar recording, slides, and links and resources will be shared in a follow-up email to all of the registrants. Now let's get started. We're excited to have the following panelists share their insights with you this evening. Itai Vardi, Research and Communications Manager of the Energy and Policy Institute. Anshul Gupta, Policy and Research Director for New Yorkers for Clean Power. Megan Burton, Senior Attorney for Earth Justice. And Jessica Achule, Executive Director for the Alliance for a Green Economy. And Danny Katz, Executive Director, Colorado PIRG. First up, we'll hear from Itai Vardi, Research and Communications Manager for the Energy and Policy Institute. He'll provide an introduction to this widespread problem and discuss recent bills that have passed in 3 states that aim to put an end to utility corruption.
Great, thank you very much, Erin. Great to be on this panel. Again, Itai Vardi, Research Manager at the Energy and Policy Institute, or EPI as we call it. He, him are my pronouns. EPI is a utility and fossil fuel industry watchdog group that monitors the way that the industry promotes disinformation, tries to obstruct a transition to cleaner forms of energy. We monitor and try again to expose those practices. I know that there are a lot of advocates and activists on this call, and I know that many of you are often frustrated by the forms of obstruction by utilities and their allies in the industry when it comes to climate policy, electrification, gas bans, and so on. It's often hard and it's slow, and we face a formidable opposition. In part, this is because the utilities and their allies have created formidable political machines that engage in lobbying, advertising, PR, brand polishing, different forms of political influence that make it hard to pass climate policy. And many of you know this, that Yes, next slide, please. Next, oh, not yet, please. Many of you know that when you pay your electric or utility or sorry, or gas bill, a portion of that goes to funding this this political machine or these political activities. This can include, again, lobbying, advertising, different forms of political influence. Next slide, please. Sometimes this goes to fund outright corruption. We've seen in the past several years tremendous illegal corruption scandals involving utilities. Just to mention one of the major ones, First Energy, one of the largest utilities in the country, was caught in recent years funneling tens of millions of dollars through obscure dark money groups to a variety of politicians and officials, essentially bribing them in order to pass a legislative bailout for failing nuclear and coal plants. They managed to do so. On the left, you see Larry Householder, the former Ohio Speaker of the House, who is now in jail following the scandal. On the right is Chuck Jones, the former president and CEO of First Energy, who was recently indicted in this scandal. Ratepayers were on the hook to fund this bailout, but also they paid for the lobbying machine and the money that went through these dark money groups. Next slide, please. But you don't have to look at illegal scandals like the First Energy one to get a sense of the political machines that we are funding through our bills. For example, what is AGA, the American Gas Association, the main industry lobbying group that represents the gas utilities? In this image, you can see that they recently hired social media influencers to engage in advocacy, form of lobbying. That is something that AGA doesn't consider in its limited limited definition of lobbying, something that should not be excised from consumers, from ratepayers funding their activities. So AGA spends on advertising, public relations, different forms of social media influencers. Recently, an AGA vice president was caught on tape in an internal meeting saying that gas utilities should build local and state consumer coalitions, essentially front groups, to serve as spokesperson or spokespeople for the natural gas industry fighting electrification. Next slide, please. And so just to give you a sense, following the revelations, the scandals, what AGA and other industry groups do, there's been a really interesting trend, movement throughout the country to try to prohibit the use of utilities, of ratepayer money by utilities to fund these political activities. So in the green, you can see states that passed just last year some of these bills, again, that prohibit what utilities can do in terms of funding political activities. In blue, you can see quite a lot of states that currently, or in this legislative session, have these bills on the table. New York, as you can see, as one of them, and it's really joining a great company in that sense. And next slide, please. Next, please. I have a few bullet points here. And so these bills have some combination of these elements. One, they have prohibitions, just like the New York bill, which we'll hear in more detail soon. The items that the utilities cannot use ratepayer money to fund. So for example, trade association donations and dues, charitable contributions, different forms of advertising, lobbying, issue advocacy. Two, the bills have a transparency mechanism. So reports, annual reports that the utility has to file with the utility regulators that disclose on a line item basis how much money is being shelled out to all of these activities. States that do have some form of lobbying and advertising ban often don't have this disclosure. And New York is one interesting case. Again, I think we'll get into that soon. And lastly, we'd like to see that these utilities also have an enforcement mechanism. As you all know, a bill without or a law without some enforcement, without teeth, often is not worth the paper that it's written on. So we are recommending some sort of automatic or minimum penalty for utilities that just attempt or try to recover these illegal expenses or costs from ratepayers. And with that, I will hand it back to Aaron.
Thank you, Itai. Up next, we have Anshul Gupta for Policy and Research Director for the New Yorkers for Clean Power. He'll share what gas utilities are doing to undermine the CLCPA and fight renewable energy in New York State.
Good evening. Thanks for the introduction, Aaron. We can move on to the next slide in the interest of time. So in this short presentation, I will give some of the egregious examples of some of the things that our own utilities like National Grid, National Fuel Gas, and Central Hudson are doing to undermine New York's landmark climate law, the CLCPA. Itai already spoke about the front groups and the trade associations, and the ones that are most active in New York are the New Yorkers for Affordable Energy, which is a front group funded by American Petroleum Institute, American Gas Association, gas utilities, pipeline companies, and also some associated labor unions that are allied with the gas industry. And American Gas Association that Itai spoke about. We can move to the next slide. So New Yorkers for Affordable Energy is a 501c6 business league, and by law they're designed to serve the interests of their members. This is a sort of a list of their members on the left-hand side, and their own tax filings show that their mission is to expand natural gas service. They have absolutely nothing to do with affordable energy in New York. Next slide, please. Again, this is a slide from one of their own internal presentations, and these are all the tactics that they use. They are actually using as we speak in New York State to lobby against the CLCPA, and right now they are heavily lobbying against the New York Heat Act, which would amend the public service law to help New York State transition off of fossil natural gas. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to give a few specific examples from utilities. These are examples of the mailers that Central Hudson and National Grid send to their own customers, because they have access to all their customers, millions of customers, and they sort of engage in disinformation campaigns targeting their own customers. In the mailer on the right, you can see they are essentially asking their own customers to submit a comment to the Climate Action Council, which is sort of very clearly lobbying. And on the left, National Grid is misinforming its customers about what they call a clean energy vision. It's anything but a clean energy vision. It's just something a sort of fake plan to decarbonize their gas using false solutions like hydrogen and so-called renewable natural gas. Next slide, please. This is a screenshot from a presentation that National Grid gave to Staten Island Community Board, in which they're talking about the CLCPA and essentially misinforming the community board about reliability, affordability, grid capacity, heat pumps, hydrogen, RNG, you name it, every single thing. And they have the community boards here because they are the utility that provides gas to Staten Island. Next slide, please. Here is a smoking gun that National Grid is sort of engaged in statewide anti-CLCPA advocacy. So there was an op-ed in Crane's Business News, uh, in which National Grid vice president wrote that hydrogen is a fossil-free fuel produced by separating hydrogen out of the water molecule, leaving only water vapor behind. So this is just incorrect. When you produce hydrogen from water, you leave oxygen behind, not water vapor behind. You can't take hydrogen out of the water molecule and still leave water behind. A few weeks later, an op-ed appeared in Newsday, penned by the executive director of Riverhead Chamber of Commerce, in which she wrote essentially the same thing, produced by separating hydrogen out of the water molecule, leaving only water vapor behind. So National Grid is trying to sort of push green hydrogen, and the executive director of the Riverhead Chamber of Commerce also writes that I learned about these so-called low carbon fuels from National Grid. But National Grid wasn't just telling them about these fuels, they were literally giving them a script to use and sort of propagate their disinformation. Interestingly, a few weeks later, another op-ed appeared in the Times Union, this time authored by the president and CEO of the Center for Economic Growth and Capital Region Chamber. And it reproduced exactly the same line, which is incorrect. Hydrogen is produced by separating hydrogen out of the water molecule, leaving only water vapor behind. So you can see the sort of the depth of coordination, and National Grid is literally handing out scripts to business groups all over the state. Next slide, please. National Fuel went a step further. It used the database of its own customers to engage in robocalling and get the customers to call their local electeds and voice their opposition to building electrification. And the data that National Fuel use is collected, stored, and maintained at ratepayer cost, and they're using that to essentially do grassroots lobbying. And I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Anshul. Up next, we'll hear from Megan Burton. She's the senior attorney for Earth Justice, and she will share the current legal framework, guidelines, and policies, and answer the question, is the Public Service Commission enforcing even the weak laws that we have now?
Thank you, Erin, and hello, everyone. So my name is Megan Burton. As Erin mentioned, I'm a senior attorney at Earth Justice. Earth Justice is a national nonprofit organization that we represent tons of community groups and environmental justice groups, often pro bono, so meaning for free. And the area of the work that I focus on is primarily climate and energy issues in New York State. And so what I wanted to walk through today is the current legal and regulatory framework around lobbying, and what the PSC, the Public Service Commission, is supposed to enforce, what they are allowed to, or what they will approve utilities from doing, and what they should prohibit utilities from doing. And so we'll start off with the New York Public Service Law, Section 114A. And that section really prohibits the commission from approving any types of rate increases that would include costs of legislative lobbying and membership dues paid to any entity that engages in legislative lobbying in customer rates. And so in this section, legislative lobbying is defined as any attempt by any person on behalf of a public utility to influence the passage or defeat any legislation by either House or legislature or the Congress or the approval or disapproval of any legislation by the governor. And so one important, I put a little asterisk at the bottom of this, is that unfortunately, PSL section 114A only covers and applies to state and federal legislative lobbying. So it does not include regulatory lobbying. It does not include lobbying at the municipal level or the local level or the city level. Next slide. And I know this was mentioned by some of the previous panelists about membership dues. Just wanted to walk you all through that in case you are unfamiliar with that. But membership dues are reoccurring payments that people, groups, and or corporations must pay to become and remain a part of a specific organization, club, or association. And so in our experience and what we have seen is that utilities across the country pay various trade association dues, membership dues. And in New York, it's often towards the American Gas Association, the New York Business Council. We're seeing a lot of activity by the New Yorkers for Affordable Energy. So what PSL section 114A requires is that utilities, it doesn't prevent utilities from participating or being a member to these trade associations. They just cannot pass the membership dues or any costs onto ratepayers, especially if those trade associations are engaged in any type of legislative lobbying. So oftentimes we see that the utilities may insert these costs in their overall request for a rate increase. And so some of the proceedings that we're engaged in when we often represent community groups is we have to engage in a lot of like digging and investigative researching to really ask a ton of questions to find out how many trade association dues is each utility paying, and are they passing that on to the ratepayers? Because oftentimes what we have found is they are not upfront or transparent about that. And it also requires then looking at those trade groups and comparing them to see if those trade groups have engaged in any type of state or federal lobbying. Next slide, please. I also wanted to highlight a policy statement by the Public Service Commission from 1977. And these are types of advertisement utilities are not allowed to send to customers and cannot recover in rates. And this is where I think utilities often try to walk a fine line. So it's generally accepted that advertising, which states a utility's position on a matter of a public controversy, such as banning gas stoves or electrification, it often reflects the political views or self-interests of the utility or its shareholders, and therefore that should not be borne by ratepayers. And ratepayers shouldn't fund any advertising which seeks to sway public opinion, whether that's legislative, environmental, governmental, consumer, and or any other kind. But oftentimes we're not seeing the Public Service Commission uphold this policy statement. And so we are being very intentional in any legal filing and constantly citing the Public Service's own policy guidelines to this. Next slide, please. And so another question is about institutional advertisement. What does the Public Service Commission say about that? And so I tried to explain here that it also addresses institutional advertisement, meaning advertising that is not clearly controversial or political. So it could be advertisement about gas, the safety of gas, or how gas is used, or how the utility may be expanding the electrical grid in order for reliability. And so we have to be careful as to like what terms the utilities are using to promote that. The commission decided not to completely exclude all costs for institutional advertisements from rates, but they rather determined that only a small percentage of rates could go towards the institutional advertisement. And that is a very, very small percentage. It's 0.1% of the entire revenue requirement. So if a utility is asking for $1 billion that the utility needs in order to improve all of its infrastructure and to provide safe and reliable service, it is only permitted to spend 0.1% of $1 billion towards institutional advertisement. Next slide, please. The other issue that I wanted to flag is just about the First Amendment. And so this is another, it's not a legal case that was brought, and it was in the Cahill versus Public Service Commission, and that the New York Court of Appeals found that ratepayers are entitled to protection against forced financial support for causes and messages that they find distasteful or that they do not approve of. So ratepayers cannot be forced to pay for some type of political messaging or lobbying or activity that they don't believe in. However, I think sometimes folks may get confused that utilities are not allowed to engage in lobbying and not allowed or not permitted to engage in any type of like political activity. What the utilities are not allowed to do is pass those costs for lobbying and advertisement that is in self-interest onto ratepayers. We unfortunately cannot restrict a utility's speech because that would be a violation of their First Amendment. And so we just have to be careful about what we are asking the utility to do and not do, and what we are wanting to make sure the Public Service Commission enforces and protects ratepayers from undue costs. Next slide, please. I also wanted to flag another policy guidance that the New York State has adopted, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's, which is a mouthful, Uniform System of Accounts. And it creates this rebuttable presumption, essentially an argument that political expenditures are not recoverable from rates, that utilities cannot ask for rate recovery from this. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission defines political expenditures as those that are intended to influence public opinion or towards elections, appointments, legislation, ordinances. So this is a little bit broader and encompasses more activity by utilities as opposed to the first statute that we started out with, which was Public Service Law Section 114A, which only captured state and federal lobbying. Next slide, please. And apologies that I'm Russian, but just want to get through it all. And so I wanted to add this about what could be falling through the cracks or what is not explicit, and that this is one thing that Solages bill is attempting to address. Because what about direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying? You know, as attorneys, like we would argue that under New York lobbying law, legislative lobbying, which also the Department of State defines to include both direct and grassroots lobbying. So we would argue that grassroots and direct lobbying falls within legislative lobbying, and therefore the Public Service Commission should prohibit recovery of these types of costs. And the other question is, well, what about local and municipal lobbying or regulatory lobbying, meaning utilities reaching out to regulators to try and influence their decision? And like there, we would also argue that under FERC's Uniform System of Accounting, which New York State has clearly adopted, those types of activities or political expenditures that are intended to influence the public as well as ratepayers should not be recovered. And so when we're engaging in any type of litigation or advocacy or justice on behalf of our clients are always very clear as to like what type of behavior and activities is permitted and unpermitted in New York State. The problem that we've run up against is that the Public Service Commission has not really been enforcing or upholding its own policy guidance or laws. And so we've been having to challenge that in court. And I believe the next panelist, Jessica Aguilé, will kind of walk through with you as to like examples of what we're seeing utilities engage in. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Megan. Up next, as you heard, is Jessica Aguilé, Executive Director for the Alliance for Green Economy, also known as AGREE. Jessica will share more about how utilities use weaknesses and the ambiguity in the current laws and regulations to lobby.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and thanks for having me. So I'm just going to give some examples from the gas utility, National Fuel Gas. This is a small gas utility in the Buffalo area, which also engages in fracking and the transport of gas into New York. So they've got a lot of interests in keeping people on gas. And they've been fighting very hard against the implementation, various pieces of implementation of our climate law. Next slide, please. So just very quickly about Agree. We're a statewide organization. We're headquartered in Syracuse, New York, but we work across the state and we have staff in different parts of the state, working to bring about a just transition to renewable electricity and heating. And a lot of our focus is on both achievement of our climate goals as well as protecting customers from undue costs and rate hikes. We have a lot of our focus of our work is at the Public Service Commission and trying to change the behavior and investments of utilities and utility regulation. Next slide. So what I'm sharing with you tonight is just some information that we discovered along with our attorneys in the case with National Fuel's rate hike, where they're proposing a rate hike. We're represented by Earth Justice. And so this is information that was discovered through information requests in that rate case and included in my public testimony. So if these slides are shared afterwards, there's a link to my testimony in there. I'm going to breeze through it really fast, but there's a lot more detail in the testimony. Next slide. So just some key takeaways. What we've seen just through this one rate case is that there's not enough investigation or oversight from the commission to fully prevent utilities from using ratepayer money for lobbying. We found several instances where utilities had used ratepayer money for lobbying or for advocating for their political positions. And these were, in our view, had not been enforced by the Public Service Commission. We found that National Fuel has used ratepayer money to advocate for their interests in ways that might not technically qualify as lobbying, but does qualify as institutional advertising. And there hasn't really been, that's supposed to be limited. But we need good enforcement of that, and it's kind of seems like it's up to advocates in the rate case to point it out and advocate for a certain outcome on the institutional lobbying. And then we also found that National Fuel has, as Anshul just talked about, has used customer data to communicate to customers about their positions, to ask them to lobby against certain policies or bills. And they communicate that with shareholder-funded grassroots lobbying messages, but they're communicating directly to their customers and using their customer data for that. Okay, next slides. So just one example of direct lobbying is that the president of National Fuel, Donna DeCarolis, has a seat on the Climate Action Council. And this is a body that was created by our climate law that was tasked with determining a plan for how to implement our climate law. And in her seat on the Climate Action Council, she advocated for multiple, various positions of the company. She called for certain legislation, and her activities and participation in the Climate Action Council, where she did that, was funded by ratepayers. Next slide. We also found that there is a website, Fueling Tomorrow Today website. And this is a website that actually was uncovered by a journalist at New York Focus, was the subject of an investigation by the Public Service Commission, because that website, which is ratepayer funded and is ostensibly supposed to be educating customers about energy efficiency, was used to link customers to a grassroots lobbying campaign. And so the commission, the Department of Public Service staff did an investigation, and they found that that link should not have been charged to ratepayers, and National Fuel had to pay a very small amount of money back. But what we have found is that still today, that website contains a lot of information that seeks to sway public opinion on matters of public controversy in New York, which Megan just talked about, and including whether gas combustion should be allowed in new buildings, talking about the policy like the All Electric Building Act. And they also use their website to promote their vision for a low carbon future. So they are using this website to promote their positions on on the climate law, on the climate plan, how New York is moving forward. And this is ratepayer funded. Next slide. And these are just a few examples from that Fueling Tomorrow Today website, which we do think, speak to matters of public controversy, which is and this is all ratepayer funded. I'll let you take a quick read of that. The next slide. And then I also just wanted to briefly touch on the use of customer emails for lobbying. So, this is customer data that customers give the utility when they sign up for service. And I know, in my case, if I give my phone number or my email to my utility, I'm doing so that they can contact me about billing and about, service outages, stuff related to my service. But National Fuel is using that information to send emails to their customers, asking them to make their voices heard on various policies that the state is considering in the legislature. And, there's this little fine print that says this campaign is paid for by National Fuel, is not paid for by National Fuel utility customers. However, I do think that there's a question of, the customer data being collected using customer money, stored using customer money. So in my testimony, I recommend that the commission really should have a policy on the use of customer data and how it can and cannot be used by utilities. Next slide. So I just want to end by making a mention that if you see something like your utility doing something that looks like legislative lobbying, that looks like it violates any of the policies that Megan just talked about, you can file a complaint with the Public Service Commission. And that really is the best way to bring it to the attention of the Public Service Commission. So we have included some information in the slides about how to do that. And with that, I will turn it back to the moderators.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was excellent. Up next, we have Danny Katz, the Executive Director for Colorado PIRG, and he'll share how Colorado passed utility accountability legislation and share lessons learned.
Great. Thank you very much. Glad to be here this evening. Thanks for having me. So again, Danny Katz, I'm with CoPIRG. It's a public interest group here in Colorado, part of a nationwide network. So some of you may be in a state where you have a PIRG as well. I will not talk about the policy SB 291. If you want me to go into those details, feel free to put it in the chat. But I think you've heard plenty so far of all the nefarious and frustrating ways that utilities use our money and the types of policies that we need to pass to limit how these utilities can use ratepayer dollars for all sorts of things. This bill, suffice it to say, this bill contained a number of pieces that limit what utilities can use ratepayer dollars for, including, not being able to use ratepayer dollars for tax penalties, for advertising and public relation expenses that aren't related to a law we've passed. For example, if we're telling them they need to promote energy efficiency, well, then that's something they can use our ratepayer dollars for, but not to build their brand or advertise at a basketball game that they exist because it's not like we're shopping around for them. There's also a lot of language in our bill around not being able to lobby for local, state, federal legislation or ballot expenses. Charitable giving can't be included. Organizational and membership dues can't be included if those groups lobby as well. So anyways, some good stuff in the bill, but I want to tell a story of how we won. So if you go to the next slide, the key pieces to getting this bill passed. The first thing is we just took advantage of a moment. And I think a lot of our wins, that's a way that we start. We all know what we need to do in life. And sometimes there's a moment that makes what we're advocating for that much more germane or powerful to the people who we're talking to. And so in our case in Colorado, the bills that we were paying, the winter bills, skyrocketed. And that created some political will. We were quick to point to gas, and I'll talk about how that relates to this topic today. There was a special select committee created. We did a bunch of outside game storytelling, and the media supported us as well. So I've got a slide for each of these, so let's go through those. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this, winter bills skyrocketed. Everybody suddenly was paying twice what they were paying the previous winter. And that created a lot of frustration around, well, what are these utilities doing? Why is this happening? The quote there, one person testified and said, oh, I thought I just missed a month payment because literally my bill doubled. I just figured I must have missed a month. So this was something that everybody was experiencing and everybody wanted addressed. Now, while it started as a high cost of gas, which was the thing driving it, it allowed us to talk about all the different ways we can save consumers money, and maybe we can peel back the ways that utilities use ratepayer dollars. So if you go to the next slide, we were quick to point to the high price of gas. If you go to the next slide, please. Yep. So gas prices went up by 40%, and utilities were caught flat-footed. Their response was, well, it's not our fault. It's just the price of gas has gone up. But I think for most of us, we would say, but you're my utility. Like, what? I'm not shopping. I didn't choose to buy gas. So what the heck? You got to do something about this. So it gave us some leverage to then put together a package of policies. If you go to the next slide, that began with a special select committee. And in this case, that's a very unusual thing in Colorado that created a moment where something was going to have to happen. You don't create a special committee and then nothing happens. It would look awfully silly. There were panels of experts that came in who talked about everything from the high price of gas to all these other things that we're talking about today. I mean, it is a waste of ratepayer dollars to invest in lobbying and pay for tax penalties and those sorts of things. So it fit into this frame of costs went up. What are we going to do about it? And we had experts testifying to that. It allowed us to explore really everything around the utility system. And as I said, action was expected. So we had a lot of leverage to get something done. If you go to the next slide, we didn't just rely on that, though. We did a lot of things to mobilize and activate people around the outrage that they were feeling, and do the storytelling and put a human face to all of this. When it comes to the amount of money that utilities are spending on lobbying, it probably is not going to cut your bill in half if we limit that, but it still can be a savings. And that's an important part of the overall story. So we did a rally for ratepayer relief at the Capitol. You can see a picture of us on the left there with signs. I think many groups on here have probably done something similar before, but it's just important to remember, as much as you have political will and a moment to capitalize on, you want to be telling those stories and you want to have that human face. I mean, the good news is there are groups on this call who they know what we need to pass. And so we don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time figuring out what should the words be. We have those words, we need to do the organizing. And so if you go to the final slide that I'll show, the media also just dove in and helped fuel the call for action, again, because of these huge price spikes. I think this is hopefully a helpful story for everyone, because I do think gas is a commodity, and that's one of the problems with it, is we don't have a lot of control over it. So to the extent you are looking for ways to be able to push back on utilities and win reforms around some of the things we've talked about tonight, Look for those opportunities when at some point in the next few years, gas prices will shoot back up again. And to the extent that ratepayers are feeling it, it is a great time to include the kinds of reforms that the other speakers were talking about earlier tonight, as part of the package of things that a legislator can do to help save consumers money and do the right thing. You know, these ratepayer dollars shouldn't be spent on this stuff. So I'll end my slides there. You can exit out there. I have more details on what the bill does. Happy to talk about that. But frankly, it's just basically some of the things people already said. So thanks.
Thanks, Danny. Really appreciate that. And congratulations on all your good work. And it's exciting to see the movement growing across the country and including in New York. So I was hoping to have a moment where we have a little bit of discussion, and feel free and encouraging everyone to enter their questions that they might have for any of the panelists from our presentation today, to put it in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And I want to go ahead and present to the panelists and ask the question about, how does the New York bill compare to some of the other states? So what does the New York utility accountability bills that are filed now, who's filed them, and how do they compare to other states? So I think I'd like to volunteer Atai to discuss that, but feel free for others to chime in.
Thanks, Aaron. I can say briefly that the California bill that, as I said, is on the table currently, has been introduced, does have an enforcement mechanism that calls for an automatic minimum penalty that will be exacted against the utility that attempts to recover these illegal expenses for political purposes. That penalty will be no less than the amount that the utility tries to recover illegally, plus a penalty that will be dispersed back to ratepayers. And there's opportunities here to think creatively. For example, that can also go into a fund to help low-income customers, EJ communities. There's many things I think that the legislation can add here in terms of an enforcement mechanism. I also think that the Solages bill might want to expand the way that it defines different forms of advocacy that's prohibited. It talks about communication or education, but not specifically about advertising. We see that it is prohibited through a policy statement by the DPS, but I think it would be stronger if it is codified in law.
Great. Thank you, Atai. Okay, well, I think, does anyone have any questions that they would like to address live? We have a few questions that we've received. Just give me a second to go through them. Did any of the panelists want to tackle any of the questions or share any ones that they might have answered in the chat that would be good for the group to hear about?
I can answer some of the questions. I think, the first one by Jay, the word lobbying, I think that there is a clear difference between lobbying and bribery. But I'm not sure if Anshul, did you respond to that, or did you would you like to answer that?
No, I did respond to it, and I'm not able to see the question. Maybe I missed something.
I mean, bribery, obviously more illegal, and it's done
Yeah.
behind the scenes,
Yeah.
exchange for a quid pro quo. It's often not documented or recorded. Lobbying, it is almost the opposite. You have to be transparent. A lot of us, the panelists, do engage in lobbying activities, and we have to log all of that activity, communication, per every 4 minutes, if you will, and like what type of lobbying, is it direct lobbying, grassroots, and all of that information is recorded and like published to the state, and that's at the city, the state, or at the federal level. So there is a difference. I think the challenge is that utilities have deep pockets and can engage in a lot more aggressive lobbying tactics, and can hire, an army of lobbyists. However, they still have to pay for that and record that activity. And I mean, I think one other question I think that's been asked by both Kim and Ryan, Kim from SANE and Ryan from LIPC, about the tension between trying to limit utilities advertisement or political messaging and lobbying, and when that runs up against their First Amendment protections and their free speech. That's why I added that in the slide of like, we can't tell them what they can and cannot say. I mean, it cannot be misleading or false information. But there have been attempts to try and limit utility speech, and that has been struck down by the Supreme Court. There has been one in New York State by the Court of Appeals, and it was challenged. I can share that case via email later, but it is a challenge. And so that's why we just want to be very clear that whatever type of activity they are engaging in, and is not paid for by ratepayers. I'm not sure, Erin, if you wanted me to answer all the questions or if other panelists wanted to dive in.
Yeah, no, that was great. I think you did a great job addressing. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to address before we begin to move on to what folks can do about this, what's happening in New York that's exciting, and how they can help move this legislation forward?
I can quickly answer Carol's question about have any of our NYS climate groups talked to PSC commissioners. So New Yorkers for Clean Power has written to, I have written on behalf of NYCP to the commissioners, and have also included this wherever we could in public comments. And so far, it seems that the commission has chosen to ignore us.
And I'll just also add that another viewer asked, have we been successful in challenging utilities with their political activity or lobbying in the past, like in 2019 in a 2020 rate case. We did challenge some of the costs on trade association dues, and filed petitions for rehearing and tried to appeal that, and they were both struck down. And so we've been trying to be more aggressive with acquiring, clear evidence that we feel like violates both like the language and the spirit of the law, as well as the various policy guidelines. And so we're working with Agree as well as We Act in another rate case, and we're hoping to be more successful and also while engaging in these rate cases, and when we're doing our investigation and finding, illicit behavior, the utilities are backing off and removing those costs from their, initial ask. So we are seeing them correct their behavior, but they should be doing that on their own. We shouldn't have to, constantly not harass, but do this in-depth investigation to catch that.
Great. Well, we're excited to figure out what to encourage this group, what everyone should do next, and how we can hold utilities accountability from all these shenanigans that we've heard about over the past hour. In New York, at the state level, actually 2 bills have been filed by Senator Brouk and Assemblymember Solages. And these bills address these issues of how utilities to restrict utilities from using ratepayer money for many of the items that were discussed here today. So we'll be sharing these links in the chat as well as in our follow-up email, but we encourage you to send your messages now to your state leaders. And you should send them as soon as possible to begin that conversation to urge their support. Also, spread the word, post these items on social media and help people get more educated on the activities that are happening not only in New York, but across the nation. You should also check out a really awesome advocacy toolkit that 350.org has created for utility accountability. We'll include that link as well. It gives a great overview of the issue as well as ways to organize in your community. And then also, if you're an organization and you haven't yet joined the coalition, we'd encourage you to join us, and we're stronger together, particularly on this issue where we always have a big fight when we're fighting against monopoly utilities. So any organizations can sign up. We have a Google form and you can express what your level of interest is. So again, we encourage you to take action and reach out to your legislators. And thank you so much for joining us, and appreciate all the time that the panelists have spent on this issue and all the hard work that they continue to do in New York. And as well as thank you for everyone that supported getting the word out about this event and continues to work towards holding utilities accountable. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a great evening.